Welcome to this month's first Friday at Fusion Studio. My name is Rich Dione. I'm co-director of the Fusion Studio for Entertainment and Engineering here at Purdue University. I'll turn this to my colleague.
And I'm Mary Pilot, and I'm the co-director of the Fusion Studio as well. Welcome, everyone.
And we're really thrilled to have you all here today. We're really exceptionally thrilled to have Brian Smallwood here today, who is the technical director, production manager at JMU, James Madison University, and also the author of a fantastic book. And I realized I left my text at my home office and I cannot recite to you the title, but I can tell you it is about productivity and wellness in live entertainment, which is our topic today. We want to talk about that. And as we begin, I'll just say that this is a hugely important topic for me and has been since the beginning of my career, and it's sort of helped frame how I think about management and how I teach technical direction. And oddly, those of you who know me, it has become even more important to me in the last 18 months as I have struggled with chronic illness for the first time in my life and seen how that affects folks. So this, I think, will be an important and exciting conversation, more than we could possibly cover in an hour. So we've pre-baked some cookies, right? It's like a cooking show. The dinner is already in the oven and cooked, but I sent to Brian earlier this week to try to cover some ground, but we'll leave time for you all to ask questions as well. So we'll just dig right in, if that's all right, Brian and Mary.
Absolutely.
I'm game.
Awesome. Well, let's just start. For those who haven't read the book, and you should share the actual title of the book as well so people can get it. What is the importance of wellness and its connection to productivity? That's an interesting connection to make, productivity and wellness for live entertainment. So can you just talk about that a little bit?
For the record, I want everyone to acknowledge the fact that Rich in no way screwed up by not remembering the name of the book, because the name of the book is Productivity Through Wellness for Live Entertainment and Theater Technicians, Increasing Productivity, Avoiding Burnout, and Maximizing the Value of an Hour, which is like a drinking game, right? Like you would start trying to remember the title, and then if you screwed up, you would drink, and then you take it from there. It's basically, for those of you interested in writing, there's a new movement to sort of put all the search words in the title. So like that's a lot of what that is. So yeah, thank you very much. And I will put it in the title. Come on, take from that. So the connection with productivity and wellness. It sort of started with my time in grad school. I spent 10 years working in New York, just working. And I struggled with workaholic nature. It was sort of fine until I got serious with my now wife, and then it started to really wear on our relationship. So I started recognizing that being a workaholic was a problem rather than an asset. And then while in grad school, I had my son and my daughter, and that became a real strain on time. And that was when I learned that I couldn't give 150% all the time. And there was a real, I also struggled with perfectionism. And so there's a real self-deprecating moment about that, like a real But once I sort of figured out that you can't be at 150% all the time, I started getting very serious about my own personal productivity in that. And that was, trying to finish my thesis and all the sort of different grad school objectives that come about. And the wellness aspect of it, as I started doing more research, it became the focus. Sleep deprivation was sort of where this all started because I was experiencing it. And right, so like that became my inroad to this. And as I started reading that, you're losing huge productivity by doing this, it got me thinking, and I've only recently found a way to articulate this, but theater is and live entertainment is a really lean scene, right? Like we are not rolling in dough until you get to like really high levels, and even then, right, we're working pretty tight margins. We focus a lot on bringing money in, right? Like audience, et cetera, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, are we utilizing what we have efficiently? And so much of the sort of mechanical design stuff that I was looking at started help streamline thinking about things efficiently. And so our own sort of management systems and efficiency and productivity as a way to maximize our resources was all sort of connected. So that was sort of where I built the bridge. And so it started with just an acknowledgement that when I'm feeling better, I'm more productive. And then I found research that says, surprisingly, anyone who feels better is more productive. And I was like, oh, there's research about this. So, and that was just not in the vernacular when I was working in the city, right? Like it was, oh, you pulled 48 hours? Wow, great overtime, right? Like it wasn't like, wow, you must have been terrible in the last, 36 hours of that. So yeah, that was sort of how it all sort of started and how I got to where I'm at. And I want to be really clear that this is a journey that I am still on. It stemmed from my own struggles with burnout, my own struggles with exhaustion and all this stuff. And I don't have it all figured out, even though I wrote a book about it. So it's sort of an invitation to everyone to sort of get in the conversation. Let's figure it out together.
Sure. Well, there's so many things that are interesting in that certainly resonate with me, right? Like I did my master's thesis when I had a relatively young child, right? And I was working a full-time job, and balancing that and learning that you can't give 150% to everything is a challenge. I'm struck by the way that, and I have always been struck by the way that idea of wellness and productivity and efficiency and time and all of that collides with some traditional core values in live entertainment, right? Mm-hmm. Live entertainment for generations, at least at a certain level, I will say that at a certain level of production, sort of thrives on this notion of sacrifice for your art, mm-hmm. right? And do what it takes to get the show open. You've got a great section of the book where you talk about the phrase "the show must go on" and the history of that, and how that's evolved to mean something different now than what it used to mean. But this notion that if we care about and are passionate about the art, we'll do what it takes. We'll put in the extra hours, even if we don't get paid overtime, right? Yes. We'll all come together, right? The sort of adrenaline rush of opening night, right? The reward that we get from all pulling together and making a thing happen that 2 days ago didn't look like it was going to be achieved. How do you reconcile those two things, right? Like there's this deep culture that says this, and then there's this other blank of research that says, well, the work is better actually if you don't do that.
Well, and what I refer to that is sort of the passion-based industry, right? Like we get into this because we want to be part of the community. We're passionate about it. I also think that there is just an inherent affirmation. Like I cannot think of a job where when you finish for the night, hundreds of people stand up and applaud, except for right? Like there is something there. Anyway, one thing that I've noticed is there's a lot of research coming out about passion-based industries and saying, hey, if it's a passion-based industry, it is actually more prone to abuse. Like if you are passionate about it, you are more likely to be taken advantage of. And I think that a lot of it is connected to, it's almost like our passion's been weaponized in a way for marketing purposes. And what I mean by that is like, I have been in circumstances where, I was working on a show and the first 6 weeks, things are going great. And then things start to get behind because I'm getting tired. And then finally we get to tech. We've been like crunching for weeks and we're getting in. I'm like, yo, I don't think I can come in for those extra hours. And people start saying, I don't know if you're passionate enough about this project, right? Like your passion, there's research that suggests that when you're passionate about something, you can be more productive about it for a period, but there's a limit. And so I think people have gotten accustomed to that and like that pace. And then they just sort of assume that it's a constant, even though we sort of wear out. So I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that market culture that you're talking about favors the producers and the people making money, right? Because like I get to pay you less and get a high-end product because you're getting something else out of it, right? So I guess, and that might be a little too damning. Like, I recognize that like it's more complex than that. We're all storytellers. We all want to be part of that. But we're really good at undervaluing ourselves in that. I also think because we build communities, right? I know many technical directors and costume designers and lighting designers and MEs and or head electricians, excuse me, who will say, "Wow, this is going to be really hard on me, but it'll be good for the team, so I'll do it." And there's a lot of like martyring that happens about it. So I think that it's important to start by looking at the history of the culture itself and really examining it closely. Because if someone said, "Hey, I want you to shorten your life by 20 years so that this person can make $1 million. And by the way, be underpaid while you do it," I don't think anyone would immediately get behind that, right? So I think we just have to have a moment of really assessing what are our values here. And I think that, the wellness aspect of it, I think that people work in live entertainment and theater, generally speaking, are really empathetic and caring. Like, it's part of our business to understand how people will feel. And so I think that there is a really good way to sort of bring these elements together, especially given the fact that, like, you're going to get better value out of what you're doing anyway. Like, you are literally wasting money by burning out your people, So I think that's where the sort of connection can be. But you're right, it's not widely understood at this point or widely agreed upon. I'm sure there are people who disagree with me right now as I'm saying it, right? So
sure. I mean, there's an interesting thing I say to students all the time about this issue, right? Our purpose, right? Our function in theater anyway, is to tell stories about being human, right? To build community and help us understand who we are and how to be better to ourselves and each other. It seems a little hypocritical if we kill each other in the process of telling those stories, right? Like, how can we actually tell stories about being human if we're not human to ourselves?
Rich, there's kind of an interesting point, because I consider myself in some regards an outsider to this discussion. I mean, I worked in other industries, but not in the entertainment industry. And it's interesting that internally there's this pressure to be passionate. And yet from an external perspective, when at least within the cultures of engineering, there's a notion that if you're passionate about your work, it can't be serious, right? It must only be a hobby. And if it's a hobby, how can you expect to be paid for that? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of this interesting and ugly kind of outside forces saying, why should you be paid for doing a hobby? And internally, the forces of, if it's a passion of yours, why should you be, expected to live normally?
Well, and that's exactly it, Mary. Like, the part of this foundation is like, oh, well, you're getting an unseen value by liking what you do. But like, then there's no acknowledgement about like when you're wiped out and you don't like what you're doing anymore. And that's like, well, you should, because you should be more passionate, right? Like, it's a sort of really weird sort of balance. And I also, Mary, I appreciate your perspective from the outside too. A lot of this issue isn't just a live entertainment issue, right? Like, this is an American / globalized society issue, right?
It's very American. It's very American.
Yeah. This whole like, hey, who are you? Oh, I am a professor. I don't say I'm a father, right? I say I'm a professor, right? Like, that's like, we have all these identities, and the work one is always sort of forward. And I really appreciate your unspoken comment too, because I think a lot of this doesn't have to be our culture. We just don't talk about it, right? There's a lot of unspoken stuff. I did this presentation for a college, and it was a very small college. And I was there with like the president and the head of HR and the head of facilities and all this stuff. And I was talking about how we need to set boundaries so that like we can have our downtime. And the head of HR said, well, that's just impossible. And I said, what do you mean? They're like, well, I'm the head of HR. If a parent calls me at 11 o'clock, I can't pick up the phone. Like, I can't ignore it, right? Like, this is too important. What about that? I can't look at the head of facilities here and they can't like ignore a phone call when it comes in at 9 o'clock. And the head of facilities said, oh, I totally ignore phone calls that come in at 9 o'clock. And they said, what? It was like, yeah, I tell my team after 6, unless something is on fire, don't call me till late the next day, because you can handle it and it can wait. And so like, there was a pressure that they were putting on themselves from other people that wasn't real.
And so this
like,
really gets complicated in this world of COVID, where now we have totally blurred our lines of work and home and family.
everybody's cat is now full-time.
So this is related to another question we wanted to talk about, and Jason actually brought it up in the chat as well. He mentioned back pain from stress. And a good chunk of your book, Brian, talks about the physical and emotional cost of overwork, right? Particularly talking about stress and exhaustion, fatigue and sleep, and the relationship to circadian rhythms and that sort of thing. And I certainly we should read the book, but I would love if you could just sort of in brief talk about stress and sleep and circadian rhythms and sort of the relationship among those things, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a follow-up that I want to ask about that.
Sure. So first of all, one of the things I feel like sleep is the first thing to get cut. It's very rare to have someone say, hey, I need you to work 10 hours, don't eat. Like, no, we get that, right? And no one says, hey, I need you to go work underwater without air. Like we get that we need these things, but sleep, where it's always like, oh, well, you can go a little without sleep. I can encroach on your sleep, right?
Well,
and
it becomes a badge of honor too, right? Like,
oh yeah,
I only got 2 hours of sleep last night, but I'm still here.
Yep.
I pulled an all-nighter and I'm still here.
Yep. And now for starters, when we start talking about sleep, when we start cutting it off, there's physical recovery that happens when you sleep. There's mental recovery that happens when you sleep. That's REM sleep. And you get somewhere around 5 sleep cycles when you sleep over the course of a normal night. Well, I thought those cycles were even, and they're not. Like, you get more REM sleep on the back half of your sleep cycles than you do in the front ones. So when you take that 8 hours of sleep and cut it to 6, you're removing tons of your mental recovery time. Now, mental recovery time is the thing that's going to help you deal with stress. So all of a sudden we start seeing more stress. It's also, by the way, your decision making, right? Like if anyone has worked through and been exhausted, you've hit the point where you're on a project and you decide it's good enough. Not because it actually is good enough, but because you're done. And you don't want to deal with this. You got 5 more things to do and it's like, this is done. How many safety issues come up from that? Right? Right? Like, ooh. When we are exhausted, we are effectively drunk. Like you behave as if you have a blood alcohol content. After 24 hours, it's like it's like having a 0.1, right? So right there, your decision making, that moment of like, I've been here for 48 hours and I'm still here. And it's like, well, then you're drunk on the job. Proud of that? Right? Like, what are you doing? But the ramifications in the long game are like when you mentioned the circadian rhythm element. If you're a day person and then you go to a night shift, that transition of like when normalcy is dangerous. And the more time you make that transition, the worse the impact. So shift work, where you got a morning shift, afternoon shift, evening shift, right? Or I guess day shift, early evening, late evening, whatever. That actually makes sense if everyone stays on their shift and can stay used to it. But when we in theater do things like, oh, we've been billed and now we're at load in and now we're sort of shifting and now we're in tech and now we're shifting again and now we're building our next show while we're in tech, so we're shifting again. Those shifts are extremely dangerous. Higher rates of obesity, higher rates of cancer, higher rates of heart problems. I didn't open this dark, but one of the reasons I wrote the book is I had 2 colleagues die at 60, just out of nowhere. And it's because of this sort of, they were technical directors. I don't have the data to back up what they were doing, but I know their hours were ridiculous, right? A lot of times I think in the US, we say, oh, that person died of heart failure. And we don't say that person's heart failure was caused by the fact that they worked a bunch and they shifted circadian rhythm. Like, we don't get to like what we get to the physical reason, but we don't get to why did the physical reason happen in the first place. So does that sort of get to your question, Rich, like about how dangerous this is?
Yeah, and one, how dangerous it is, and also just sort of what it means, like what are the elements of it, right? And partly because I want to sort of establish that groundwork, because as you kind of alluded to, as a follow-up, the live entertainment industry, the work processes that we have embraced, right? Like let's not talk about like culture, but like the work processes, particularly the regional theater, summer theater environment, and Broadway, right? New York commercial theater, is we do these daytime rehearsals and daytime builds, and then we shift midstream to lots of night work without any transition. That also coincides with a huge stress time.
Yes.
And then we shift back to day work after tech.
My favorite is you do that and you probably pull longer hours, right? Now you're 60, 70, 80. And then they go, okay, it's time for us to go on a break because we're back on a 40-hour schedule. And it's like,
right,
that's not a break. That's right, like putting it in the red zone and then dumping back to like the yellow zone.
Right, you know? Right. You overrun the engine in third gear, and then you shift it back to where it's supposed to be, and then but it's where it's supposed to be, not a break. And so exactly. the typical regional theater seasonal calendar is this boom and bust of just like what people should be doing, that way too much stress and exhaustion, changes in daytime, nighttime work, which mess up your circadian rhythms, then back, then back, then back. It's almost like the work process is it's like someone sat down and said, what is the least healthy way we can set up the work schedule?
Yeah.
And I wonder, right, like there's some great stuff in your book about how to deal with that, how to manage that, right? Which is important, right? How to make it manageable. But I wonder, is that the best solution long term to sort of make it manageable? Are there ways that we could approach the whole thing and say, right, I like to throw things out with the bathwater and see what happens. So we're like, here's an apple cart, I'm kicking it over. Could we just change everything? What would that look like, do you think?
Well, we are well into what does Brian think and not what does the research hold. So I want to make it really clear that it's not like, well, this guy says the research says, right? I think the fundamental problem that we face is that we look at everything from a project level. And what I mean is that if we're doing a season of shows and there's 8 shows, we don't look at it as a season. We don't look at it as a consecutive period and goals and milestones within. We look at it as 8 separate projects. And if you look at the project from the standpoint of like, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to do normal work weeks, and then we're going to ramp up, but then it'll open, and then things can relax for anyone but a stage manager. Right? Like the idea that like, then there's recovery built in. That sort of holds for a guest director who came in and did this one project. It holds for a guest designer who came in and did that one project, right? And if the TD was working on that one project, okay. When we start gear shifting though, and we start saying, well, actually like the TD's on every show. Now there's no recovery anymore. When we start saying, well, the designer, yeah, they wrapped this project, but in order to have a living, they've also had to book this other project right after, and they're jumping from tech to tech. Same thing with the director, right? Like when we're in the sort of gig economy mindset and we're not paying very much on the gigs, people have to fill in those gaps, and all of a sudden we're not looking at the year, right? We're planning each individual element and not considering the ramifications back and forth. So I think step one is think about your season as a year and what's the ebb and flow and what are the milestones in there. And academia is real, like I see the chat blowing up about this. Academia makes it really rough to do that too, because you're trying to do a production of theater season and maintain a course schedule. And the course schedule is a job in itself. It is rare, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's rare to say, okay, we opened, show just closed after a week of productions, so we don't hold class this week, right? Like we don't give our students the recovery time. And even if we did, you know, they're probably taking classes in other departments that don't get that anyway, right? So like there was a comment about like, what are we doing to students and all this? And it's true, right? Like they're working not just the theater job, but their job of being students. And by the way, also probably their other job paying for school. So I think that's the thinking about the ebb and flow that way is a good way to approach it. Think about the ramifications that you have on every team member and get that as part of everyone's mindset. The idea that we would say we don't have enough money for that, or there's not enough space on stage, we get behind that, right? No one suggests we blow out the back wall of the theater to like extend the stage upstage, right? What if someone said, that's not sustainable for this human to do in a safe way? We're gonna have to come up with a different answer, right? Like we approach materials and space and wellness with the same level of priority. A good example on this that from my own experience, we were doing this production and it became clear that a staffer was going to need to supervise all of the shows, right? All the evening productions, and they were a day employee. So when we did it, we said, okay, take a week off, right? Like take a week to transition to the new schedule. Don't come in, just recover. And then once you're recovered, you're on the night shift. And even though we had 3 shows a week and there's 3-day thing, like you're going to be on the night shift the whole time until that thing wraps, and then take the week off. Now by week, I think it was like 4 days because we were sort of like working through the transition period. But acknowledging that these choices have an impact and making space for that impact, right? And also don't do it all the time, right? I don't know. I feel like, and I'm sure Rich would agree with this in light of his book. There was a comment made that if you're working overnight, there was a planning failure isn't always true. Sometimes it's a scope issue, right? Like we are asking to do too much for the resources we have available. A lot of what the book sort of addresses is like, we have to line that up. I think that we need to start building in more flexibility in the way that we operate. I think that when we put together an estimate at the top of a project or a design comes in and this is the final design, we suddenly start acting like this is Amazon and we're going to order that and we're going to have it in a couple of weeks. And if it's not that, then someone screwed up and I want to talk to customer service. Instead of saying, this is our goal, but it is malleable. And as we're going, if things come up like lumber prices skyrocket or someone gets sick with a pandemic-based disease and now they're not available, we're going to change the design and change the goal so we can still tell the story, but in a way that's sustainable. And anecdotally, and this could just be because I'm in this circle, but like designers are down with that. Like no one wants to burn anyone out because they all relate, unless they're burnt already and they're like, well, I went through it and now you do too.
I mean, it's an interesting collision of different cultures and systems and processes, right? And so I tend to be a systems thinking kind of person. And, some of the things that inform all of this are for decades an organizational structure in live entertainment that did have the designers and the directors be in charge of everything, right? And so you have this conflict of interest between the management of people and resources and the artistic goals. And, the last 20, 30 years, we started to separate that out, right, in important ways. And as you were talking about, staff members taking a week off and the boom and bust cycles of time and effort, I'm thinking back to my time putting together, multi-million-dollar budgets for a full year and looking at ticket sales and not being able to fathom or stomach having the theater dark for a chunk of time, because that's income that we're not making because seats are empty, right? So there's all of these levels of influences that at some point need to be unpacked, right? Because if you say, let's take an extra week to load this in because that keeps our folks healthier, that is potentially tens of thousands of dollars of revenue gone from the season.
But do you need that revenue?
I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it. I think that's the question.
Well, that's where I'm going. You're absolutely right. We're looking at the revenue. We're looking at the income. Right. But we're not looking at how much did it cost. So I 100% agree with you. I 100% agree with you that it's time to look at it through that lens, right? Like if this is a healthy way to do it, what can we actually expect to do?
Absolutely.
Which is not a conversation many people want.
And it's a conversation, one of the things that that I try to teach in my classes here is that is an important thing for technical managers to feel comfortable doing, to be very comfortable saying, like, your job isn't to find the way to make a thing happen. Your job is to find a way to assess whether we can make a thing happen with the resources that are available. That includes time and people. Yes. And when you can't, report that back and say, what you're asking for is beyond what's possible.
There's an interesting expression comes from the safety world. They'll talk about if you're hired as a safety person and you make a bunch of safety recommendations and the bosses say, that's great, but we're not going to do them. We don't have the money. We don't have the time. You're no longer the safety person. You're the designated felon. And the idea is when someone gets screwed up, they got someone to point at because they're not going to listen to you. And I think that there's an interesting assumption that we don't have agency and that if we say no, that they're just not going to listen and we got to make it work. And I think that the hard part is it true? Like you have to test it. And if you go and you talk and you make recommendations that are wellness-based and people say, I don't give a crap, you still need to deliver this, then you know, okay, you're not actually interested in me as production manager. You just want what you want. And now you just know that you're in the fire festival, right? Like, just know that's what you're doing.
I will say I had that exact conversation as a TD at a summer theater that won't be named, right? Because they were all well-meaning people, right? But we did a show, it's a packed season, and I worked some of the things you already talked about, right? I worked 38 hours straight, in part because I wasn't going to make my crew work overnight. Yep. So I sent them home and I worked alone, dumb mistake number one, 36 hours straight, dumb mistake number two, to make sure that we achieved a goal. That show, once we got it open, I went to the artistic team, the leadership team of the theater, and I said, everything about this was wrong. Yeah. And this isn't what you don't pay me to work 36 hours building scenery. You pay me to tell you whether we can do the project or not. And that's the skill set I bring as a TD. That's my job. And I need to know that for the rest of the season, we're going to have that conversation because you couldn't hear me on this one. And to their credit, they said, yeah, no one's ever talked to us about it that way before. So, and the rest of the season got better. But it took a lot of, it took getting my butt kicked.
Yes.
To say, I can't do this. I wish that I had had the courage to say something sooner.
Well, and the other thing I want us to acknowledge here is where do we have agency and where don't we? And I appreciate you sort of exerting your agency in that way. We have little ways that we can impact other people. One of the first things, this is something that recently came around on, was what are we asking designers for as TDs? I have a lot of technical directors who say, I did not get a complete package. And so I don't fully understand what it is that I'm doing here. And I can't possibly do my job without a complete package. And many of us were trained in MFA programs where a complete package was drafting of every piece, painting of every piece, model, sketches, research pictures, prop Bible, all this sort of stuff. They were trained to do that in the grad program in case they got to the point where they could make corporate money, right? In case they got to the point where they were going to be compensated at a level to generate these deliverables, they need to generate the deliverables. But we got used to them, right? So we go out in the world, we're like, where's my full package? And it's like, that designer is making, what, $3,000, right? Maybe. And like union, $4,500 or whatever, right? And if you ask them for, 120 hours of work before they even come into the space, right? Like before anything even starts. So like, what are the heuristics that you can use to get a sense of what someone's looking for? Where can you say, listen, just give me a painting of one and give me like, give me a paint by numbers map of what this is, or give me a model that's painted only and I'll work off of that. Where are the things that you can do to minimize the demand that you're making on someone else? And then if you offer that and you express that, my experience is the other person is going to be very interested in making sure that they don't burn you out either. And if you can't pay someone $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000, if you can only pay them $500, ask them for $500 worth of work. Don't ask them for $15 $1,000 worth of deliverables, right? So I think that's another aspect of like our community trying to figure out how to operate is like, what's the ask and how specific is the ask? What I often talk about in props and costumes is you can buy it and build it and get exactly what you want, but it's going to be more expensive, or you can pull it and borrow it and it's going to be cheaper, but you're going to have to be flexible about what you want. So like that spectrum, I think could be really useful in terms of moving forward. Like, where do we need it to be exactly this and where can we judge?
I think that's all that is a great point and relates again to the sort of idea that there are so many parts of this large system that is live entertainment or the entertainment industry writ large that impact this, right? The fact that we do pay designers basically 1 week's worth of a livable wage to do 8 weeks worth of work, right? Like that is unconscionable.
Banana cakes.
And that impacts the deliverables that we get that as a TD or production manager, then that impacts the work that we're, and it all rolls downhill. And eventually you've got a carpenter who's working an overnight call because we didn't pay the designer enough to get us the clear information weeks ago. It's all interesting. We've got about 20 minutes left. And there's one other thing that I wanted to get to that we sort of, the three of us talked about before, and you kind of alluded to it when you said, when you share with the administrator or the director or whomever, these are my concerns about safety or wellness, and you get an answer back that is either yes, we support that, or we don't. Something that I have noticed that I think is really exciting and energizing about more and more of the students and early career professionals I work with is that they're not willing to put up with the crap that I put up with when I started in this industry. They're not willing to work a summer gig for $200 a week and crappy food for free. They're not willing to pull all-nighters. They have set some good, healthy boundaries for themselves. I'm an early career professional. I'm a student. I'm 2 years out of grad school, whatever. I'm looking for that job. I'm interviewing. How do I suss out, in your opinion, again, we're way out of the realm of research now. This is just you as your experience and expertise.
It's just you, me, and the webinar. Let's do it.
Right? Like, how do I suss out what kind of a culture this particular company has in terms of wellness? How do I get those questions answered so I know what I'm walking into, so that I can make an informed choice about whether I'm saying yes or no to this? Even if they don't support wellness, if I know that going in, I'm deciding to engage in that company.
I think this is before salary transparency. There was a lot of the techniques that you would utilize are similar, right? So I think some of this stuff is very glaring and obvious. All right. So the first question is, what's a typical work week? And what's an atypical work week? And how common does an atypical work week happen? And I think that's important because oftentimes they'll say atypical work week and that's their typical work week, right? There was a company who said, hey, listen, our hourly rate is not great, but we will guarantee you 20 hours of overtime every week. And when you do that, it starts turning into a pretty decent amount of money. That means their standard is 60-hour work weeks, right? Like that's a sign about what that culture is going to be like, right? Do the math on that. I also think that, like most industries, there's a lot of who you know that goes into our industry. So identify other people that have worked there. Start finding out what's going on. You mentioned the current, new up and comers aren't going to deal with the stuff that we dealt with, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a type of person that thrives in this environment, right? Those are the people who went off, started businesses, and then held that as a standard because it worked for them. It is only recently, and I credit a lot of sort of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice initiatives with identifying this. There is a privilege with that, right? And you are excluding a huge chunk of the workforce, right? Like I think it was Sylvester Stallone years ago said that we are never going to see some of the best actors in the world because the industry scares them away because it's so abusive, right? In the same way, I think that I think that there's an inclusivity movement with the new up and coming generation. Like everyone should have a seat at the table here. So why would we just favor the type of person that is willing to work nonstop and not have a family and not do the, whatever it's going to take that it used to take, right? So I think paying attention to hours, paying attention to the reputation about the industry, the workplace culture, those are big signs. I would also just straight up ask, right? Hey, when you're at the interview phase, I often say it's just as important to not get the job that's not going to work as it is to get the job that is going to work, right? Yes. Just say, hey, if I get exhausted and I need to take some days off because of it, how do you handle that? Right? And if they go, then you found one, right? Like, gotcha. Ask the honest questions. What do you do to take care of people after tech? What's the work schedule like after tech, right? In the book, I give a case study from someone who remained anonymous. And I think the anonymity reflects an issue with the industry that they didn't feel like they could share their name. But they talked about how, at the place that they were working, they'd finish this like crazy week, and then they would just get weeks off, paid. And then if you wanted more time off, you could take it at any time because they knew the money was in that week and the value was in that ridiculous week. And they knew it was a huge ask. So they would do whatever it took to make that week go well, including respect your time and recovery so that the next time you need that week, you can do it, right? So I think that as difficult as it is and as tough as the sort of reputation is for the industry, there is traction and movement, and there are examples and leaders. I mean, everyone in this, every attendee of this is now here for a reason, right? You're able to make change in positive ways the places you go. Like this can be the grounds for good stuff. And I think that asking about that is key. Ask about 10 out of 12s. Do you do 10 out of 12s? Do you do 6-day work weeks? Boom. Yeah. Those are factors. Ask how many shows they do in the year,
I think if there's one takeaway, sorry, I know you want to say something, Mary, I'll just say this out and give it to you. For our students and early career professionals is value yourself enough to ask. Yes. And recognize that you are an important commodity, right? Your time.
Yeah, well, and even freelance, be transparent about your boundaries. I mean, one of my jokes is, when you go and you set up cable, they'll say, okay, we'll be there on Tuesday between 7 a.m. and 1 a.m. the next morning. And you're like, but you're only pissed that they show up before or after the time because they've managed your expectations. So same thing, like, hey, listen, I can give you 9 to 6 today, but then I'm done. And if they go, well, hey, we got a chance to go over, can you stick around and say, nah, I'm sorry, I told you. And they go, yeah, all right. And yeah, you're good. So, I'm sorry, Mary, you were saying?
I just had a thought.
Away for a moment, forgive me.
Yeah. Please. I just had a thought while you were, talking about the ask, like what do you ask of others? And that's really explicit. But as someone who is very productivity oriented and project completion oriented, so I'm a recovering person of whom you speak. I think
I'll see you at next week's meeting.
Yeah, thank you. I think what you sometimes often forget is that people are watching you.
Yes.
And so you are modeling, even though you may say, well, I don't expect that of my people. If you are modeling that, and if how they view you is successful or whatever, that they're striving for, you may be inadvertently signaling some really bad behaviors. And I mean, I often tell my students, I've never figured out work-life balance. Go figure it out, yes. Right? Don't do what I do. Figure it out, because it's hard to be a recovering addict. Yes. In this category. It's very, yes. very hard.
Well, and you're right. Like with the moment, Richard's example of sending someone home so he can stay and work late, he's in charge. So that sets us, it's like, oh, I get it. When I'm good enough, I can go for 48 hours straight, right? Like that's the standard I need to be striving for. I think that's very accurate. And the stuff that we do in our Ask email, there are a lot of I have a dear friend named Ryan Dowd, and he talked about tacit agreements, right? I think a lot of what we're talking about is the unspoken agreement, right? And the notion that if I sent, Mary, let's say it's 11 o'clock at night tonight, and I send you an email, and you're up, right? Probably working based off what you just said, but you're doing your thing. The email comes in, you now know that I've emailed you and assume that I want a response, right? And so I've now put pressure on you to get back to me. And if you're staying up late working and now pulling yourself out of it to get back to me, right? So like one of the things I'm trying to do, I use Outlook's, they have an option to delay sending. And I'm trying to get better at being mindful about what time it is when I email someone or text someone. Because even if I'm like, okay, I just need to deal with it right now, I don't want to make them deal with it right now. And chances are it can wait. Like even the most stressful circumstance that you can imagine, where it's like time is of the essence, it must happen. I feel like I have been on the show where we hit that point and it didn't happen, and what, show still opened. Like maybe something was different, but it still happened. There's a lot of pride in delivering that sometimes translates to self-worth connected to delivering, that turns into pressure to deliver nonstop, because who am I if I don't deliver nonstop? And like, I don't know, it's a weird conundrum, because a lot of educators will say, oh, well, I can't possibly step out of class when I'm sick, because how will the students learn what I was going to teach them? It's like, well, they won't, but they'll be fine, right? Like, oh, I can't possibly take a sabbatical this semester and have someone else teach the course because the quality of what they learn won't meet yeah, that's true, but they'll learn something. It'll be okay, right? Like they are still going to go and graduate and do the thing. So I don't know. I haven't unpacked that part yet. I'm still working through it myself.
I think we're ready, Rich, to open it up to some Q&A.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot, but there's a lot to talk about. I imagine the folks who are in the room may have some questions or comments. So if you haven't yet shared something in the chat, please do.
Yeah, I've been doing little up carrots to uplift statements. I should have been doing it nonstop. Every comment that I'm seeing out of this chat is just gold. And I thank everyone for being so honest and sharing their feelings and sharing their experiences. I mean, really appreciate you. Really appreciate you.
This is that moment in class when I go, how long do I sit silently and make everybody sit uncomfortable?
And Zoom, like I've had a lot of people like in other industries, like just be comfortable waiting. And I'm like, you don't understand, in theater, 5 seconds is an eternity. Like if something was supposed to happen and it takes more than 5 seconds, everyone starts going, what? So I feel like that instinct kicks in Zoom as well. So I'm right there with you. People need time to type and stuff. I've been told that, normally count to 5, Zoom count to 10.
Oh, that's
so 10. I'll sit there and go 1, 2, and I'm like, uncomfortable, no one's speaking. And then I get to 10. This is me vamping while people apparently don't type because there's no questions so far.
I think that means that you've been brilliant and told them everything they need to know.
I'm very comprehensive in my answers, and I answer questions people didn't even realize they have.
This is a great question. How do you have conversations with folks about these topics in the heat of the moment?
Yeah, it is very difficult to drop something like this on the moment. So I think that constant communication is key, right? It should not be a surprise, right? And by should not be a surprise means like, you've been updating people on how this is going. If someone's really passionate about needing to get something done, and it's like, listen, my crew's burning out, and they're like, well, I don't really feel like you're passionate about this. It's probably not the moment to have the conversation, because they're very passionate, you're passionate in a different way. So saying like, I appreciate your perspective and I am willing to talk to you about it later after I've cut the crew and we've gotten a night's sleep. So I am looking forward to chatting with you about this tomorrow. Like, this is the thing, right? Like, if a producer comes in and says, no, I need you all to work, they're not the ones doing the work, right? And you could say, I'm sorry, I'm cutting the crew and I'm going home. Like, well, if you do that, then, don't come in tomorrow. Take a moment and go like, are you serious? Because if you don't want us to come in tomorrow, no one knows what's going on. No one. Like, because I'm in charge. I'm not coming in if you tell my crew not to come in tomorrow. So like, are you sure you want to do that? Just think about that before you decide. And it's a real uncomfortable moment. There's this great story. I love this story. There's this colleague who I worked with, and he was working on a show, and they gave him a payment in 3, right? So you got a third up front, you got a third at like load in, and a third at tech or opening or something like that. Or he was 50-50. He got half up front, half at opening. So he goes to all this trouble. He does the design, builds the set, gets the whole thing done. And then it's the day before opening. And they go, hey, listen, the money's not there. We're not going to be able to give you the second half. I'm so sorry. We just didn't realize it. And this happens all the time. All the time. He goes, okay. So they come in for opening night at 6 o'clock. And the set has been cut in half. And they call and they say, what did you do? And he said, well, you paid for half the set, so you get half the set. Not only did they have to pay him the full amount, he had taken the top half, put it in his truck and taken it with him. They need to pay him to put the other half back on, right? So my point here is this: we have far more agency. And they'll threaten your reputation. Oh, you'll never work again in this town. It's like, not for people like you, but people who care about their employees, when they hear, like, that's a different option. And like, there are a lot of mulligans on people's careers, right? Like, people say like, oh, you screwed up, you'll never get a chance again. Like, there's tons of chances. So in the moment, I would say negotiate time, right? In the moment, manage the expectations of the moment, and don't fight it on those terms. Don't do it in front of the crew, right? Yeah. Like, don't do it in front of everybody.
I would say to add to that, there's 2 things to consider, or 2 things that I would add is, first, and I talk about this book all the time, getting to yes, right? Separate the interpersonal conflict from the actual thing under discussion, right? In that moment, the heat comes from all of the emotional content, the anxiety, the stress, the pressure, the desire to perform well, right? If a director's coming at you that way, it's because they want their show to look good. They're feeling that pressure. If the artistic director's coming at you that way, it's the same thing. Separate that and the need for that relationship to be protected. That's one conversation from the actual topic under discussion. And Brian said, we can talk about that later when we're not exhausted. That's exactly it, right? Like, the issue is we're exhausted. We have to go right now, or it's an unsafe environment. Let's talk about what that means later when we can do that safely. The other thing that Brian talks about a lot in his book, and he just mentioned, is the notion of building a culture towards this, yes, right? Or a practice towards this, so that moment when everything's gone to heck in a handbasket isn't the first time anybody's heard that there are issues, that there's been a constant reporting process, and that there's methods in place for activating change. And I think that is, it's the chapter of my book that I did not write nearly enough about, and that I need to go back and revise. But that's the important part, is the fact that there is a feeling that there's a safety net for the whole organization, that if change has to happen because we're in a bad place, there's a method and a process by which we can come to a good decision, vet it against resources, time, and ability, and then implement it. And that can seem like it's impossible in the heat of the moment, but that is the process that we need to go through. And if there is a method, that is useful. So there's 2 things that came up in our 3 minutes left. The first is a question about setting a top-end expectation at academic theaters, like how much do we expect our folks to work? And then someone in the chat has said, or in the question and answer, they're currently working a 5-day work week. They want to move to a 4-day work week. And have you experimented with that type of schedule? These are related questions, right? About how much time do we expect of folks? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research that suggests that a 5-day, 8-hour week is as productive as a 4 10-hour, right? I want to say I heard recently that it was like 4 8 hours, but that's a side note. It sort of depends on the level of the type of work you're doing as well. A 40-hour work week is for sort of physical labor, 30-hour work week for decision making and knowledge work. So that's sort of where that sort of gray area is coming from. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And in fact, deciding how you want to break that up. Do you want it 4 days in a row? Or do you want to go 2 day off, two, right? Like what's nicest for everybody, right? You're going to get similar productivities out of it. In terms of the academic, I'm actually in the midst of trying to assess this right now, right? I think that for the sort of top-down sort of assessment of how much do we need, it's a bigger conversation than just technical. Like we need to find out how much time do directors need? How much time do designers need? How much time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can get, something that's interesting is that like 10 out of 12, one thing that people commonly do with 10 out of 12s is they'll stop doing them, but then they'll start adding on evening shifts in advance to get the same number of hours. And it's like, you're good on you, except you're kind of missing the point, which is you can do this in less hours, right? I think that there needs to be, quite frankly, study in our own industry. I'm very interested in pursuing this, by the way, to sort of assess how can we understand productivity in our industry. One of the things that makes it really hard, like if we're trying to assess productivity in making jeans, I don't know why I go into that, but like it's easy. How many hours did people work? How many jeans were done? But we're in an industry that is basically constantly prototyping, right? It's just the prototype is the product. So like, how do you know how effective you were and what are the measures of success within that sort of prototyping process? So I think that we need to identify sort of what are our standards, what are our goals, what are our measures for this? But I also think that, I think another reason why in academia there's not a lot of traction is I don't think there's a lot of empathy because everyone's fried, right? Like everyone's going, well, if I'm working nonstop, why shouldn't they? Because they're burnt. And like, of course you feel that way. You're super stressed out, like you're suffering. And the idea is someone's like, well, I don't want to suffer. And it's like, but I am. Like that's a lot of what's going on. So I think that this sort of top-down assessment needs to be all inclusive and needs to bring everybody to the table and address everyone's wellness across the board. And then if we can start there, assessing the students' health can be a conversation as well, like with the students per se. And I think that it's not going to be, here's the flat answer for everyone, right? I think it's going to be, we have to meet people where they are. I had student workers this semester, some of whom routinely worked 10 hours a week. Some routinely worked 2 hours a week. Some worked 10 hours and then didn't work for 2 weeks and then came in for 3 hours, right? Like, because their schedule needs were shifting. And so trying to anticipate that and meet people where they are was part of the thing. And you know what the good news was? Like, despite that tumultuousness, we met our deliverables, we met them on time, and we had a really positive experience. Like people stepped out saying, wow, that was really great. And you know what the next thing they started saying was like, well, maybe the shows were smaller than they normally are, because that's what they'll inevitably do. They'll inevitably say, if people aren't exhausted, then clearly the scope wasn't as big as it could have been. It's like, no. It was a big process. These are big accomplishments. We didn't shortchange anyone. It's just, we did it in a nice way. So I hope that helps in some way.
Brian, I think that this has been a fantastic conversation. I know that folks, we're a little past one and folks are getting ready to move on to the next things, but thank you so much for taking some time with us today and for writing the book and all the research that went into it. It is such an important and timely conversation to have in our industry.
In every industry.
In every industry, absolutely. So thank you all for coming. and look forward to our next First Friday. We believe we'll be able to feature the winning team from the Stage Machine Design Competition, which is tomorrow. So Mary and I have a busy weekend ahead, but we hope to be able to have that team here to talk with you all about their process and about their design.
And we will rest and recover from that.
And we will rest and recover after our long weekend. So thanks again, Brian, and thank you everybody for joining us.